sounds like a story to me. Some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't you...
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Avram Davidson universe. Very excited to sit down again with Tim Anderson. We're going to be discussing another Eszterhazy story. We're going to be listening to Milord Sir Smiht, the English wizard. Interesting thing about this particular story is it was never published in F&SF or any other magazine before its publication in the Enquiries of Dr. Eszterhazy in December of 1975. Tim Anderson is a former journalist and PR manager. He started writing fiction seriously 3 years ago and now has placed more than 50 pieces in a wide variety of genres and publication. He's been reading science fiction and fantasy from an early age. He has a great blog and an author page, which I'll make sure to share on the podcast. In terms of what's going on at the Avram Davidson universe, as I've mentioned, Dragons in the Tree is done. It's published. That's Avram's amazing travel journal to British Honduras / Belize. I also now have published The Adventures in Dr. Eszterhazy in paperback and ebook. I'm always looking for great guests. Also throw me a proposal if you have a great idea. If you'd like to host an episode and you have a great guest, I'm open to that. And with that said, I'm going to bring on Tim. Tim, as always, thanks so much for joining us again.
That's my very great pleasure.
Yeah. So any news in your world before we get into Avram and the story today?
Yeah, well, I'm a third of an anthology which is coming out towards the end of May called Triple Obscura 3. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. It's my wife and I's wedding anniversary coming up, so we're away for a weekend. And next weekend, my son and I are going up in a hot air balloon. So
Wow.
that should be interesting.
You'll
Luckily,
definitely
I've
have
got
to.
a fear of heights. So
You have a fear of heights?
no, I don't. No.
Oh, you don't. I do. So that sounds terrifying to me. Triple Obscura. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, an author called Rhys Hughes, who's written lots of books, and particularly lots of short stories. One of his ambitions was to write a linked cycle of 1,000 short stories, which he completed a couple of years ago. But he's continuing to write, thankfully. But this is the second in a series he's done of authors who he likes, but who aren't mega famous. So we each get a third of the anthology, which is 6 stories, in my case, about 20,000 words.
Oh, that's great. We'll have to definitely look it up for sure.
As I said, end of May is what Rhys thinks.
Well, today we are listening to another Adventures in Dr. Eszterhazy, and I'd be curious when you first discovered Eszterhazy. And I just a little bit of background in case folks didn't get a chance. You and I had another episode a couple back, and so this is I'm starting to revisit some of the Dr. Eszterhazy stories because we just put it in print again, which I'm really excited about. I think it's been, I don't know, 30 years maybe since it was in print. So
I think the original paperback, which is the one I read first, came out in the mid-70s.
Yep.
And then the 90s, I think the hardback came out, the expanded hardback version. So yeah, so probably is 30 years since it came out.
Yeah. So I'm
Um,
glad, as I mentioned in the last episode where I talked about Eszterhazy, this paperback, it's not as beautiful as the one that the hard copy, but it's there. We have an ebook version. We have a paperback version. We use the original map from the Enquiries of Dr. Eszterhazy as the cover, and so I'm just thrilled that new readers can find it, and old readers who had the original Enquiries, whose book has fallen apart, like most of them have, will have an opportunity to get a paperback again. So yeah, tell us a little bit about how you originally found the Eszterhazy stories.
I got the paperback when it came out as a US import. In I can't remember which science fiction bookstore I got it in, but I loved Avram before that,
Yeah.
so I bought this, and it was wonderful because it's like when has done a lot of stuff set in second half of the 19th century, early early 20th, the Edwardian period, particularly in England. Um, but this is, it's like a tribute to all of the writers who were popular in that period. So there's a bit of Sherlock Holmes in there. There's a bit of some of the occult writers or the horror writers, particularly Arthur Machen, I think.
Yeah.
Um, there's a bit of the Ruritanian romance, and in fact specifically mentions Ruritania in there, which started the whole trend for that, and Graustark, which was the the closest imitator and most popular imitator by George MacDonald Barr, um, and obviously lots of the things which I knew about in that period, but all in Avram's unique style. And there's I think, a lot of adventures on history in there as well. There
Yeah.
are some of the stuff that he's done in there. Almost when you read the Esterhazy, seems like he's written up his notes for the stories in the form of one of those investigations into myths and legends.
Yeah. I know, and I know you just took some of the information you put on your blog post. You did an amazing blog post about Esterhazy. Anything else that you'd want to bring up that you included in there?
I mean, I did a bit of research, I'm coming on here, so I
Mhm.
did look up where the triune monarchy was, and it's basically takes over what at the time was Bulgaria and Romania, no, Bulgaria and Serbia, with a bit of Romania, a bit sliced off the Ottoman Empire down at the bottom. Um, but the feel of the Balkans is clearly there, and those countries themselves were fairly new at the times of the Esterhazy stories. They didn't really become independent of the Ottoman Empire until 1877, after the war between the Russians and the Turks, where part of the deal was those countries which had been allies of the Russians during the war then got their independence. So that whole period in the Balkans is a fascinating one because the Balkans had been ruled by everybody and their dog or doge at one point. There've been bits of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when that was larger. Bits of it were ruled by Russia at various points. The Mongols, the Ottomans, everybody has ruled that part of the world at one point or another. But they still have lots of their own traditions. There's a series by a historian called Bethany Hughes looking at Treasure of the World, and the latest one is looking at a lot of those Balkan states and looking at their history and delving right back into their past. Quite a fair bit of which pops up in the Esterhazy stories. as origins of some of the legends there, but also some of the people who have lived and ruled there over the centuries.
Today we chose Milord Sir Smiht, the English wizard. Well, I chose it, I should say. For me, I think it's one of the funniest of the Eszterhazy stories. I'd be curious if you have a favorite, whether it be in the Ultimate Adventures or whether it be from the original Enquiries. Uh, what's your favorite if you had to choose one?
I like this one, particularly because of the other writer it reminds me of, strangely, is P.G. Wodehouse. Because like Wodehouse, who would spend a year doing a novel and often write a summary of the novel, which was longer than the novel was, um, but his plots were like a domino rally. Like he'd set the elements off, started off, and just one after another they would fall till they got to that inevitable pattern at the end. And this one's a bit like that, that the elements are clearly there. There doesn't appear to be there's no padding in there that doesn't need to be in there. It goes straight
Mhm.
through. And it is very funny. Well, I've just been rereading some of the later written but chronologically earlier stories. And I'm really loving those again as well.
Um, yeah, no, I definitely agree. A curious question that's come up a lot, and it came up in the last episode on Eszterhazy, is the order which you recommend that folks read it. What comes to your mind? There's different opinions. I have mine. I said that last time what they were, but what's your opinion and how people should read the Eszterhazy stories if you were telling them best practices?
Um, oh, it is a difficult question to answer because I obviously read the later ones first,
Mhm.
which tend to be shorter, and then the early ones after. On the later ones, you obviously get the mature Eszterhazy, him as a fully formed character, whereas some of the younger ones are showing his journey. But I mean, after the first one, Cornet Eszterhazy, you do get a feeling of who he is anyway. So, and he's not doesn't change that much from episode to episode. So almost, if you want to get a feeling of the Triune Monarchy, then because there's a lot more about that in the earlier stories, it's almost worth starting in the order in which they are chronologically in their own world, because you then build up the picture of Eszterhazy and you build up the picture of Scythia, Pannonia, Transbalkania.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. I felt like so, and I'll say this very quickly because it's a little repetitive, but for me, publication date made the most sense just because I felt like Polycharm set up the world. You got to see the world, and I felt like I got a little confused when I got thrown right into the middle, having never read it before. But yeah, I've gotten such a variety of opinions, and so it's a fascinating topic. One thing about Milord Sir Smiht, the English wizard, that I thought was fascinating is when I went back to see its first publication date. Its first publication date, as far as I can tell, is in the Enquiries of Dr. Eszterhazy. It was not published alone in a separate magazine, like most of them had. So that was kind of fascinating for me.
Yeah, and I saw you suspect that he's obviously been writing the stories because he loved the locale and the character and the history. And then along comes the potential for a book deal. So he sees the
Yeah.
opportunity to write some more stuff in that area, and
Yeah.
which may well have been brewing for a bit in his head. Like most of the original publication dates aren't that much earlier than the paperback came out.
I'll have to send you the, remind me, I should send you the earlier, there was a book that he had started to write, a novel, and also a proposal for a novel later on. I should send that to you. I think you'd really get a kick out of it.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, should we dive into the story?
That sounds like a plan.
Let's do it.
Milord Sir Smiht, the English Wizard. The establishment of Brothers Svartbløy stands, or squats, as it has done for over a century and a half, in the court of the Golden Hart. The inn, once famous, which gave its name to the court, has long since passed off the scene, but parts of it survive. Here a wall, there an arch, and by sole way of access a flight of steps. So old had been the inn that Bela, imperial capital of the triune monarchy, had slowly lifted the level of its streets around about it. The shops in the court of the Golden Hart are an odd mixture. First, to the right of the worn 3 steps, is Florian, who purveys horse crowns, though the sign does not say so. All, in fact, that it says is Florian. There is nothing on display in the window being composed of small pieces of bull's-eye glass set in lead, a very old window, with the very old-fashioned idea that the sole duty of a window is to let light in through a wall. What are horse crowns? Has the reader never seen a funeral? Has he not noticed the crowns of ostrich plumes, black for an ordinary adult, white for a child or maiden woman, violet for a nobleman or prelate of the rank of Monsignor or above, bobbing sedately on the horses' heads? Those are horse crowns, and nobody makes them like Florian's. To the left of the steps is Weitmondel, who makes and sells mother-of-pearl buttons in all sizes. However great must be the natural disappointment of the fisher in the far-off gulfs of Persia, when he opens his oyster and finds no pearl within, he can still take comfort in the thought that the shells, with their nacreous and opalescent interiors, must find their way to the great city of Bela, where Weitmondel will turn them into buttons, all the way from the great buttons which adorn the shirts of the coachmen down to the tiny buttons which fasten children's gloves. Facing the steps in the court of the Golden Hart is the shop of Brothers Svartbløy, who are purveyors of snuff tobacco. There are other shops, to be sure, in the Golden Hart, but they are of a transitory nature, some of them lasting a mere decade. Florian, Weitmondel, and Brothers Svartbløy are the patriarchs of the place, and of them all, Brothers Svartbløy is the oldest. The shop contains 1 chair, in which scarcely anyone dares to sit, a wooden counter, and behind the counter a wooden shelf. On the shelf are 5 stout jars, each the size of a small child. One is labelled Rapis, one is labelled Minorca, one is labelled Imperial, one is labelled Habana, and one is labelled Turkey. Should anyone desire a snuff of a different sort, some upstart sort of snuff, a Johnny-come-lately in the field of snuff, say, for example, peppermint, wintergreen, or cocoa Dutch, woe upon him! He had better never have been born. Words cannot describe the glacial degree of cold with which he will be informed. The Sweet shop is across the court. Here we sell only snuff tobacco. One day comes Dr. Eszterhazy to the shop in the court of the Golden Hart. He is not walking very fast, In fact, as he has been following someone, and as that someone was taking his own good time, it may be said that Engelbert Eszterhazy, Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Jurisprudence, Doctor of Science, Doctor of Literature, etc., etc., was walking decidedly slowly. The man he was following was tall and heavy and stooped, and wore a long black cloak lined with a dull brown silk. Now, long black cloaks were not then the fashion, and Lord knows when they had been. It would be supposed that anyone who wore one did so in order to create a certain impression, to draw upon himself a certain amount of attention. In all of Bela, so far as Eszterhazy knew, there were only 2 other men who went about in long black cloaks. One was Spectorini, the director of the Grand Imperial Opera. The other was von Greitzmannsthal, the court painter, and both had their long black cloaks lined with red. To wear a long black cloak and then to line it with brown, this indicated an individualism of the very highest order, and as he could scarcely in good manners stop this strange man on the street and confront him with his curiosity, therefore he followed him. Down the street of the apple presses, no apples had been pressed there in decades, left into the street of the beautiful Vista. The only vista there nowadays was that of a series of dressmakers' shops. Down the Place Moritz Louis, containing 6 greengrocers, 2 florists, a French laundry, a cafe, and a really awful statue of that depressed and indeed rather depressing monarch, and thence into the court of the Golden Heart, and thence into the establishment of the brothers Swartbloy, snuff tobacco. One of the brothers was behind the counter. He looked at the first newcomer, from as far down as the counter permitted him to observe, all the way up to the curious hat. It was made of black velvet, and bore a silver medallion of some sort, and while it did not exactly appear to be a cap of maintenance, it looked far more like a cap of maintenance than it did like anything else. And he, the brother Swartbloy, permitted himself a bow. The first newcomer drew from his pocket an enormous snuff-box, set it down, and uttered one word. "Rappee." The brother took up a brass scoop, reached it into the appropriate jar, removed it, set it on the scales, removed it, and emptied it into the snuff-box. The quantity was just enough. 100 years and more in the business of estimating the capacities of snuff-boxes gives one a certain degree of skill in the matter. The tall man placed on the counter a coin of 5 koperkas. The snuff of the brothers Swartbloy does not come cheap, and a card, allowed himself a nod of thanks, and turned and left. His face was craggy and smooth-shaven, and indicative of many things. When the door had closed behind him, the brother again bowed, this time more warmly. "And in what way may I help the august Sir Doctor?" asked he. "By supplying him with 4 ounces of Imperial." Small purchases at Swartbloy's are wrapped in newspaper when not decanted into snuff-boxes. Larger purchases are wrapped in special pleated paper parcels, each supplied with a coloured label. The label shows a gentleman in the costume of the reign of Ignaz Ferdinando, applying 2 fingers to his nose. His expression is one of extreme satisfaction. These labels are coloured by hand by old Frau Imglotch, whose eyesight is not what it was, and the results are more than merely curious. They are proof of the authenticity of the label and of the product. "I had the honour of seeing the august Sir Doctor some months since," said the brother, "when I was at Hieronymus's." He named Eszterhazy's tobacconist, the source of the famous cigars. "Obtaining of our usual supply of Habana clippings for our famous Habana snuff tobacco. I am wondering if the august Sir Doctor is giving up cigars in favour of snuff?" He was a dry, thin sort of man, with a few dark curls scattered across his bony skull. Automatically Eszterhazy took a sight-reading of the skull, but it did not seem very interesting. "Ah, no," he said. "It is for one of my servants, a Saint's Day present. However, were I to take to taking snuff, be assured that it would be the, I have no doubt, justly famous snuff of the brothers Swartbloy. Who was that gentleman who was just in here?" The brother, with a bow at the compliment, passed the card over. "Milord Sir Smiht, wizard anglais, specializing in late hours and by appointment." In a very elegant copper-plate hand had been added, "Hotel Grand Dominique." "One does hear," the brother said, "that the British nobility are of a high and eccentric nature." "So one does, often," Eszterhazy agreed. It might not have been high, but it would certainly have been eccentric for a member of the British aristocracy to put up at the Hotel Grand Dominique. He reflected, not for the first time, he knew, and not for the last, he expected, on the persistence of the continental usage of milord, a rank not known either to Burke or Debrett. As for the name Smith, no one to the south or east of the English Channel has ever been able to spell it right, nor ever will. He put down his money and prepared to depart. Now that he knew where the stranger was to be found, it was no longer necessary to dog him about the streets. He looked up to find a familiar, if not a welcome, expression on the face of the brother, who proceeded as expected. Might he take the very great liberty of asking the august Sir Doctor a question? He might. Ah, the august Sir Doctor was very kind. But still the question was not forthcoming. Eszterhazy decided to help him along. Most such silences following such questions followed a certain pattern. "If the question involves past indiscretions," he said gently, "I should represent the Dr. Leduc, who has a daily advertisement in the popular newspapers. It is not that. Well, if the question involves a failure of regularity, I should recommend syrup of figs. What? Not that either? Then you must come right out with it." But the man did not come right out with it. Instead, he began a sort of history of his firm and family. The first brothers Swartbloy were Kummelmann and Hugo. They were succeeded by Augsto and Franz begat Kummelmann II and Ignaz. "I am the present Kummelmann Swartbloy," he said, with an air of dignity at which it was impossible to laugh. "My brother Ignaz, he is at present in the mill salting the turkey, has never married, and it does not seem that he ever will. My wife and I, she is the daughter and only child of my late uncle Augsto, we have been wed for 15 years now, but there have been no children. After all, no one lives for ever, and how would it be possible, Sir Doctor, for there to be no brothers Swartbloy in Bella? How could we leave the business over to strangers? And there are so many medicines, one hardly knows where to begin. Could the august Sir Doctor recommend a particular medicine known to be both safe and effective?" The august Sir Doctor said very, very gently, "I should instead recommend my colleague, Professor Dr. Plotz, of the Faculty of Medicine. You may mention my name." The Hotel Grand Dominique has come down in the world since the days when it formed a stop on the Grand Tour. Long after having ceased to be fashionable among the gentry, it retained an affection on the part of the more prosperous of the commercial travellers. But it was at that time near the East Railroad terminal. It is still, in fact, near the East Railroad Terminal, but since the completion of the Great Central Terminal, the shabby old East only serves suburban and industrial rail lines. Consequently, the commercial travellers who stop at the Grand Dominic either are very uninnovative or very old, and in any event very unprosperous, or else they are merely unprosperous by reason of such factors as not selling anything worth buying. In fact, for some several years, the Grand Dominic has stayed open solely because its famous half-ducat dinner, served between 11 and 3, is deservedly popular among the junior partners and upper clerks of the many timber firms who still hold out in the adjacent neighbourhood. The rooms are thus ancillary to the hotel's main business, so the rooms are, in a word, cheap. They are also, no management having been vigorous enough to undertake architectural changes, rather large. Milord Sir Smiht sat in a chair and at a table in the middle of his room, lit by the late afternoon sun. The rear of the room was dim. One caught glimpses of an enormous bed, hugely canopied, and reached by a small step-ladder, of an antique clothes-press, a wash-basin of marble and mahogany, a sofa whose worn upholstery still breathed out a very faint air of bygone fashion, and a very strong odour of present-day rapee snuff, although it was actually rather unlikely that this last came from the sofa, and vastly likely that it came from the wizard Anglais himself, who said, "I've seen you before." Eszterhazy said, "You left a card in the Court of the Golden Heart, and so that was why you followed me halfway across Bella, because you knew I was going to leave my card in a snuff-shop, eh?" The conversation was in French. Eszterhazy smiled. "The milord is observant. Well, it is certainly true. My interest was aroused by the distinctive, I may say, distinguished appearance." The milord grunted, took out an enormous watch, glanced at it, shoved it across to where his visitor could see it. "My terms," he said, "are 2 ducats for an half-hour. It has just now begun. You may ask as many questions as you please. You may do card tricks. You can spend the entire time looking at me. However, if you wish the employment of the odylic force, then we should commence at once. Unless, of course, you are willing to pay another 2 ducats for any fraction of 1 half-hour after the first." Eszterhazy wondered, of course, that anyone so seemingly businesslike should find himself a wanderer in a country so distant from his own, let alone a lodger at the Hotel Grand Dominic. He had learned, however, that the role which people see themselves as playing is not always the same role in which the world at large perceives them. "To begin with," he said, taking one of his own specially printed forms from his pocket, "I will ask Sir Smiht to be kind enough to remove his hat for the length of time which it will take me to complete my examination." The Englishman gazed at the forms with the greatest astonishment. "Good God!" he exclaimed. "I did once, long ago, at Brighton, to be sure, pay a phrenologist to fumble and peer about my pate, but I never thought that a phrenologist would pay me for the privilege." "Ah, Brighton," Eszterhazy said. "The Royal Pavilions, what an excursion into the fantastique! Do you suppose that the first gentleman of Europe might have been the first gentleman in Europe to have smoked hashish?" Smiht snorted. Then his face, as he began to take his hat off, underwent a certain change. He completed the gesture, and then he said, "Brighton, eh? I suppose you must speak English, although I don't suppose you are English?" "As a boy, I often spent my holidays with the family of my aunt, who lived in England." Then let us cease to speak in French. Much better for you to struggle than for me. Furthermore, if you have been in England, you ought to know damned well that the title Sir never precedes the family name without the interposition of the Christian name, although in such instances as that of Sir Moses Montefiore one would employ another terminology. A point which I cannot get across to the continental mind, confound it. I consent to Milord, because it is, I suppose, traditional, as one might say, and I submit to Smiht, because I realize how difficult the th is to speakers of any other language, except Greek and, I suppose, Icelandic spellers. Here he paused to draw breath and consider his next phrase, and Eszterhazy took the opportunity to approach him from behind and gently place his fingers on the man's head. He was slightly surprised when the other went on to say, "Anyway, the baronetcy absolutely baffles the continent of Europe. Small wonder, I suppose, when every son of a baron here is also a baron, and every son of a prince here is also a prince. No wonder the continent is simply crawling with princes and barons and counts and grafs. No primogeniture. Ah, well. Now, suppose you just call 'em out to me, and I'll write 'em down. Can't read this Gothic or whatever it is, so you needn't fear I'll get me back up if you decide I'm deficient in honesty or whatever. Just say, second down, third over, eh?" "First down, first over," said Eszterhazy. Without moving his head, the Englishman reached out his long arm and made a mark in the first column of the first row. "I was christened George William Marmaduke Pemberton," he said. "Called me George was what my people called me. Marmaduke Pemberton was a great-uncle by marriage, long since predeceased by the great-aunt of the blood. Made dog biscuit, or some such thing, grew rich at it, or perhaps they were digestive biscuits, it doesn't matter. As he had never gotten any children on Aunt Maud, and never remarried after she died, couldn't get it up, I suppose, rest of me people, they thought, well, let's name this un after him, and we'll leave him all his pelf, you see, under the condition of his assuming the name of Smith Pemberton. Baronetcy was to go to me oldest brother. Well, old Marmaduke left me beans, is what he left me. Rest of it went to some fund to restore churches. Snivelling parsons had been at him, don't you see? Second down, fourth over. Very well. At any rate, say what you will, always tipped me a guinea on my birthday, so out of gratitude, and because I couldn't stand the name George, I've always used the style Pemberton Smith. Can I get any continental printer to spell Pemberton correctly? Ha! Gave up trying. Now, as to the odyllic force, or forces, in a way it began with Buller Lytton, as he called himself before he got his title. Never read any of his stuff? Awful stuff. Don't know how they can read it, but he had more than a mere inkling of the odyllic, you know. What's that? Fourth down, first over, dot and carry one. And in a way, of course, one can say it all goes back to Mesmer. Well, tut-tut, of course, Mesmer had it, although poor chap didn't know what he had. And then Oscar took a Maori bullet at a place called Pa Rui Nang Nang, or some such thing. Damnable is what I call it, to die at a place called Pa Rui Nang Nang, or some such thing. Sixth down and 5 over. Awa Tuan Bizarre. The next thing one knew, Reginald had dived into the Hoogly. Likely story, that, and never came up. Inspector Croc got him, poor chap. Better mouthful than 100 scrawny Hindus. Ah, well. George William Marmaduke Pemberton Smith fell silent a moment, and helped himself to 2 nostrils of rappee snuff. "And what's the consequence?" Here is my sole remaining brother, Augustus, heir to the baronetcy, and here's me, poor fellow, name splashed all over the penny press, because why? Because of a mere accident, a thing of nature. Here am I, as I might be here, demonstrating the odyllic forces before a subcommittee of the Royal Society, one of whom, Pigafetti Jones, awful ass, having kindly volunteered to act as subject, disappears, leaving nothing but his clothes, down to the last brace-button, belly-band, and ball-and-socket truss. Well, after all, is this a scientific experiment, or is this not? Are there such things as the hazards of the chase, or are there not such things as the hazards of the chase? First off, laugh. Then they say, very well, bring him back. Then they dare to call me a charlatan, me, and then... Dimly, very dimly, Eszterhazy remembered having read long ago, and it had not been fresh news even then, of the singular disappearance of Mr. Pigafetti Jones, Astronomer Royal for Wales. But what he was hearing now provided more details than he had ever even guessed at. It also provided, if not a complete explanation, for at least an assumption as to why Milord Sir Smiht was, and had long been, wandering the continent of Europe, and perhaps farther, a remittance man, as the British called it. That is, in return for his keeping far away, and thus bringing at least no fresh local scandals to his family's embarrassment, the family would continue to remit him a certain sum of money at fixed intervals. It was still not clear, though, if he were already a baronet, or was merely assumed to be because his father was one, or had been. And as for the odyllic forces, said the tall old Englishman calmly, I am quite confident that there is more than one. And for the moment he said no more. Had he read Eszterhazy's mind, then? Or was it merely a fortuitous comment of his own in his own disjointed manner? Or, for that matter, the latter went on in a generous tone of voice, take Zosimus the alchemist, if you like. Come in! The hall porter came in, bowed with ancient respectfulness. The hall porter was rather ancient himself, laid down a salver with a card on it, and withdrew. Aha! Business is picking up. 15 down, 3 over. Eszterhazy had not stayed beyond the half-hour, but made a semi-appointment for a later date. The card of the further business awaiting Milord Sir Smiht was facing directly toward both of them, and he could hardly have avoided reading it. And it read, Brothers Svartbløy, No. 3, Court of the Golden Heart, Snuff Tobacco. Third Assistant Supervisory Officer Lupescus, of the Aliens Office, was feeling rather mixed emotionally. On the one hand, he still had the happiness of having, recently, reached the level of a third assistant supervisory official. It was not every day, or even every year, that a member of the Romano-speaking minority attained such high rank in the imperial capital. On the other hand, a certain amount of field work was now required of him, and he had never done field work before. This present task, for instance, this call upon the second councillor of the British legation, was merely routine. Merely routine, my dear Lupescus, his superior in the office, second ASO von Glucki, had said. Easily enough said, but routine or not routine, one had to have something to show for this visit, and it did not look as though one were going to get it. Smith, the second councillor was saying testily, I tell you that I must have more information. What, Smith? All that Lupescus could do was to repeat, Milord Sir Smiht. Milord, there is no such rank or title. Sir, why, that is merely as one would say Herr or Monsieur. And as for Smith, by the way, you've got it spelled wrongly there, you know. It is S-M-I-T-H. Well, you can't expect me to know anything about anyone just named Smith. Why, that's like asking me about someone named Jones in Cardiff or MacDonald in Glasgow. No, you wouldn't know about those. Oh, well, it's like asking me about someone named Novotny in Prague. Do you see? Lupescus brightened just a trifle. This was something. Very dutifully and carefully he wrote in his notebook, "Subject Milord Smiht, said to be associated with Novotny in Prague." With his best official bow he withdrew. Withdrawn, he allowed himself a sigh. Now he would have to go and check out Novotny with the people at the Austro-Hungarian legation. He hoped that this would be more productive than this other inquiry had been. One would have thought that people named Smiht grew on trees in England. Eszterhazy's growing association with the white-haired Englishman took, if not a leap, then a sort of lurch forward one evening, about a month after his first visit. He had sent up his card with the hall porter, who had returned with word that he was to go up directly. He found Smith with a woman in black, a nondescript woman of the type who hold up churches all around the world. Come in, my dear sir. Look here. This good woman doesn't speak either French or German, and my command of Gothic is not— Well, ask her what she wants, do, please." Frau Widow Apterhotz wished to be placed in communication with her late husband. "That is to say," she said, anxious that there be no confusion nor mistake, "that is to say, he is dead, you know. His name is Emile." Smiht shook his head tolerantly at this. "Death does not exist," he said, "nor does life exist, save as states of flux to one side or other of the sidereal line, or astral plane, as some call it. From this point of view, it may seem that anyone who is not alive must be dead, but that is not so. The absent one, the one absent from here, may now be fluctuating in the area called death, or he or she may be proceeding in a calm vibration along the level of the sidereal line, or so-called astral plane. We mourn because the dead are not alive, but in the world which we call death, the so-called dead may be mourning a departure into what we call life." Frau Widow Apterhotz sighed. "Emile was always so healthy, so strong," she said. "I still can't understand it. He always did say that there wasn't no hell, just heaven and purgatory, and I used to say, 'Oh, Emile, people will think that you're a Freemason or something.' Well, our priest, Father Ugaro, he just won't listen when I talk like this. He says, 'If you won't say your prayers, at least perform some work of corporal mercy, and take your mind off such things.' But what I say—" She leaned forward, her simple, sallow face very serious and confiding. "I say that all I want to know is he happy there? That's all." Pemberton Smith said that he could guarantee nothing, but in any event he would have to have at least one object permeated with the odyllic force of the so-called deceased. The Frau Widow nodded and delved into her reticule. "That's what I was told, so I come prepared. I always made him wear this. Let them say what they like, he always did. But I wouldn't let them bury him with it, because I wanted it for a keepsake. Here you are, Professor." She held out a small silver crucifix. Smith took the article with the utmost calm, and walked over and set it down upon a heavy piece of furniture in the dimness of the back of the room. There were quite a number of things already on the table. Smith beckoned, and the others came toward him, Frau Widow Apterhotz because she was sure that she was meant to, and Eszterhazy because he was sure he wanted to. "These," said Smith, "are the equipment for the odyllic forces. Pray take a seat, my good woman." He struck a match and lit a small gas jet. It was not provided with a mantle, and it either lacked a regulatory tap or something was wrong with the one it did have. Or perhaps Smith merely liked to see the gas flame shooting up to its fullest extent. At least 2 feet long the flame was, wavering wildly, and a reddish gold in colour. Certainly he was not trying to conceal anything. But these were interesting, certainly, whatever else they were, and Eszterhazy took advantage of the English wizards at the moment administering to himself 2 strong doses of rapee, 1 in each nostril, to scrutinize the equipment for the odyllic forces. What he saw was a series of bell jars. That is, at least some of them were bell jars. Some of the others resembled rather Leyden jars. And what was all that under the bell jars? In one there seemed to be a vast quantity of metal filings, in another quicksilver, in the most of them organic matter, vegetative in origin. Every jar, bell or Leyden, appeared to be connected to every other jar by a system of glass tubing, and all the tubes seemed fitted up to a sort of master tube, which coiled around and down and finally upward, culminating in what appeared to be an enormous gramophone horn. "Pray touch nothing," warned Milord Sir Smiht. "The equipment is exceedingly fragile." He took up a small, light table, the surface of which consisted of some open lattice-work material, Eszterhazy was not sure what, and moving it easily, set it up over the horn. On it he placed the crucifix. "Now, my dear sir, if you will be kind enough to ask this good lady first to take these in her hands, and to concentrate, if she will, entirely upon the memory of her husband, now on another plane of existence." The widow Apterhotz, sitting down, took hold of these, in this case a pair of metal grips of the sort which are connected often to magnetic batteries, but in this case were not. They seemed connected in some intricate way with the glass tubings. She closed her eyes. "And," the wizard continued, "please to cooperate in sending on my request, which, after all, is her request, translated into my own methodology." He began an intricate series of turnings, of taps, of twistings, of connections at joints and at junctions, of connectings. At length he was finished. "Emil Apterhotz. Emil Apterhotz. Emil Apterhotz. If you are happy wherever you are, kindly signify by moving the crucifix which you wore when on this plane of existence. Now!" The entire massive piece of furniture upon which the equipment for the odyllic force, or forces, was placed, began to move forward. "No, no, you Gothic oaf!" shouted the milord, his face crimson with fury and concern. "Not the sideboard, the crucifix, just the crucifix!" He set himself against the sideboard and pressed it back. In vain, in vain, in vain. In a moment Eszterhazy, concerned lest the glass tubings should snap, reached forward to adjust them so that the intricate workings should not be shattered and sundered. The wizard, panting and straining against the laboratory furniture as the heavy mass continued to slide forward, 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 and suddenly slid rapidly backward, Milord Sir Smiht stumbling and clutching at empty air, Eszterhazy darting forward, and the 2 of them executing a sort of slow, insane schottische, arm in arm, before coming to a slow halt. And then, oh, so grumpy, wiping his brow with a red bandana handkerchief, of the sort in which navvies wrap their pork pies, hear Milord Sir Smiht say, "I must regard this session as questionable in its results, and I must say that I am not used to such contumacy from the habitants of the sidereal line." Frau Widow Apterhotz, however, clearly did not regard the results as in any way questionable. Her sallow, silly face now quite blissful, she stepped forward and retrieved the crucifix. "Emile," she said, "was always so strong." And on that note she departed. Herr Manfred Mauswarmer at the Austro-Hungarian legation was quite interested. "Novotny in Prague, eh? That seems to ring a bell." Third ASO Lupescus sat up straighter. A faint tingle of excitement went through his scalp. "Yes, yes," said Herr Mauswarmer. "We have of a certainty heard the name. One of those Czech names," he said, almost indulgently. "One never knows what they may be up to." Very carefully he made a neat little note, and looked up brightly. "We shall, of course, first have to communicate with Vienna." "Oh, of course." "And they will, of course, communicate with Prague." Herr Manfred Mauswarmer's large, pale, bloodshot blue eyes blinked once or twice. "A Czech name," he noted. "An English name. Uses the code cipher Wizard. Communicates in French." He briefly applied one thick forefinger to the side of his nose. He winked. Lupescus winked back. They understood each other. The hare had had a head start, but the hounds had caught the scent. One of the bell jars was empty, had in fact always been empty, although Eszterhazy had merely noted this without considering as to why it might be so. He did not ask about it as he listened now to the Englishman's talk. Milord Sir Smiht, his cap on his head, his cloak sometimes giving a dramatic flap as he turned in his pacings of the large old room, said, "The contents of the vessels in large part represent the vegetable and mineral kingdoms. I don't know if you have noticed that." "I have." "The animal kingdom, now, well, each man and woman is a microcosm, representing the macrocosm, the universe, in miniature. That is to say, we contain in our own bodies enough of the animal and mineral to emanate at all times, though we are not aware of it, a certain amount of odylic force. Or forces. Or forces. A point well made. However, now, although the average human body does include usually some amounts of the vegetable kingdom, so much potato, cabbage, sprouts, let us say, undergoing the process of digestive action, flap went his cloak, as well as the ever-present bacteria, also vegetative, still, the chemical constituencies in our body now, I forget just what they amount to, 4 and 6, more or less, in real money. Or is it 2 and 6? One forgets. Still, primarily the human organism is an animal organism. Flap. Eszterhazy, nodding, made a steeple of his hands. "And therefore, Pemberton Smith will correct me if I am wrong, when the human subject takes hold of that pair of metallic grips, the 3 kingdoms, animal, vegetable, and mineral, come together in a sort of unity. A sort of triune monarchy in parvo, as it were. Yes, correct. I see that I was not wrong in assuming that yours was a mind capable of grasping these matters." Flap. "And then it is all a matter of adjustment. One turns up the vegetative emanations, one turns in the mineral emanations, and then, my dear sir, one hopes for the best. For one has not as yet been able to adjust the individual human beings. They are what they are. One can turn a tap, one can open a valve or loose a valve, plug in a connecting tube or unplug a connecting tube, but one has to take a human body just as one finds it. Pity, in a way. Hello, hello. Something was happening in the empty bell-jar. Mists and fumes, pale blue lights, red sparks and white sparks. Milord Sir Smiht, dashing hither and thither and regulating his devices, stopped suddenly, looked imploringly at Eszterhazy, gestured, and said, "Would you, my dear fellow? Awfully grateful." Eszterhazy sat in the chair, took the metal grips in his hands, and tried to emulate those curious animals, the mules, which, for all that they are void of hope of posterity, can still manage to look in two directions at once. Direction number 1. Pemberton Smith, as he coupled and uncoupled, attached and disattached, turned, tightened, loosened, adjusting the ebb and flow of the odyllic forces, animal, vegetable, and mineral. Direction number 2, the once empty bell-jar, wherein now swarmed what? A hive of microscopic bees, perhaps. A faint tingle passed through the palms of Eszterhazy's hands and up his hands and arms. The tingle grew stronger. It was not really at all like feeling an electrical current, though. A perspiration broke forth upon his forehead. He felt very slightly giddy, and the wizard Anglais almost at once perceived this. "Too strong for you, is it? Sorry about that." He made adjustments. The giddiness was at once reduced, almost at once passed away. And the something in the bell-jar slowly took form and shape. It was a simulacrum, perhaps. Or perhaps the word was homunculus. The bell-jar was the size of a child, and the man within it was the size of a rather small child. Otherwise it was entirely mature. And it was really not the correct pronoun, for the homunculus, or whatever it was certainly a man, however small. A man wearing a frock coat, and everything which went with frock coats, and a full beard. He even had an order of some sort, a ribbon which crossed his bosom, and a medal or medallion. Eszterhazy thought, but could not be sure, that it rather resembled the silver medallion which Milord Sir Smiht wore in his hat. "Pemberton Smith? Who is that?" "Who? That? Oh, that's Gomes." He pronounced it to rhyme with Rome's. "He's the Wizard of Brazil. You've heard of Gomes, to be sure." And he then proceeded to move his arms, hands, and fingers with extreme rapidity, pausing only to say, "We communicate through the international sign language, you see. He has no English, and I have no Portuguese. Poor old Gomes. Things have been ever so slack for him since poor old Dom Pedro got the sack. Ah, well, inevitable, I suppose. Emperors and the Americas just don't seem to go together. Purely an old-world phenomena, don't you know?" And once again his fingers and hands and arms began their curious, rapid, and impressive movement. Yes, he muttered to himself. I see. No, really, you don't say. Oh, too bad. He turned to Eszterhazy. Within the jar the tiny digits and limbs of the Wizard of Brazil had fallen, as it were, silent. The homunculus shrugged sadly. "What do you make of all that?" asked the Wizard of England across the waters. "What? Is it not clear? The ants are eating his coffee trees, and he wishes you to send him some Paris green, as the local supply has been exhausted. My dear chap, I can't send him any Paris green. Assure him that I shall take care of it myself tomorrow. I say, that is ever so good of you. Yes, yes. Pray excuse me now whilst I relay the good news. In far-off Petropolis, the summer capital of Brazil, the wizard of that mighty nation, much reduced in size, wizard, not nation, by transatlantic transmission, crossed his arms upon his bosom, and bowed with gratitude in the general direction of the distant though friendly nation of Scythia, Pannonia, Transbalkania. All men of science, after all, constitute one great international confraternity. The saint's day gift of snuff was so well received by Frau Widow Orgatz, Eszterhazy's cook, who had taken his advice to stock up on coffee, that he thought he would lay in a further supply as a sweetener against the possibility of one of those occasions, infrequent but none the less to be feared, when the Frau cook suffered severe attacks of the vapours, and either burned the soup or declared, with shrieks and shouts audible on the second floor, her intense inability to face anything in the shape of a stove at all. So, on the next convenient occasion, he once more made his way to the court of the Golden Heart. 4 ounces of the imperial. He peered at the Swartbloy brother, who was peering at the scales. "You are not Kummel, man," he said. Almost, but not. "No, sir, I am Ignatz," said the brother. "Kummelman is at the moment in the mill, salting the turkey, I know." Ignatz Swartbloy looked at him with some surprise and some reproof. "Oh, no, sir. Kummelman always grinds the rapee, and I always salt the turkey. On the other tasks we either work together or take turns, but never in regard to the grinding of the rapee or the salting of the turkey. I had been about to say, sir, that Kummelman is at his home, by reason of his wife's indisposition, she being presently in a very delicate condition." And he handed over the neatly wrapped packet of pleated paper bearing the well-known illustrated label. This one old Frau Imgloch had tinted so as to give the snuff-taker a grey nose and a green periwig, neither of which in any way diminished the man's joy at having his left nostril packed solid with Brothers Swartbloy snuff tobacco, though whether rapee, imperial, Minorca, Habana, or turkey has never been made plain, and perhaps never will be. "Indeed, indeed. Pray accept my heartiest felicitations." The brother gazed at him and gave a slight, polite bow, no more. "That is very kind of you, sir. Felicitations are perhaps premature. Suppose the child will be a girl." Said Eszterhazy. Well, there is that possibility, isn't there? Thank you, and good afternoon." He could not but suppose that this same possibility must have also occurred to brother Kummelman, and in that case, he wondered, would a second visit have been paid to the large, antiquated room in the Grand Dominic, where the Milord Anglais still prolonged his stay? Herr von Parfus pursed his lips. He shook his head, gave a very faint sigh. Then he got up and went into the office of his superior, the Graf zu Kluck. "Yes, what?" said the Graf zu Kluck, whose delightful manners always made it such a pleasure to work with him. More than once had Herr von Parfus thought of throwing it all up and migrating to America, where his cousin owned a shoe store in Omaha. None of this, of course, passed his lips. He handed the paper to his superior. "From Mauswarmer in Bella, Excellency," he said. The Graf fitted his monocle more closely into his eye and grunted. "Mauswarmer in Bella. he said, looking up, has uncovered an Anglo-Franco-Czech conspiracy aimed against the integrity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Indeed, Your Excellency, said von Parfus, trying to sound shocked. Oh yes, there is no doubt of it, declared Graf zu Kluck, tapping the report with a highly polished fingernail. The liaison agent, of course, in Prague, where else, is a man named Novotny. The password is wizard. What do you think of that? I think, Your Excellency, that Novotny is a very common name in Prague. Graf zu Kluck gave no evidence of having heard. I shall take this up with His Highness at once, he said. Even Graf zu Kluck had a superior officer. But then long years of training in the civil service of Austria-Hungary cautioned him. That is, he said, as soon as we have had word on this from our people in London, Paris, and Prague. Until then, mind, not a word to anyone. Your Excellency is of course correct. Of course! Of course! See to this, at once! Von Parfus went out, thinking of Omaha. Not until the door had closed behind him did he once again. Obersee-Leutnant Commander Adler had had a long and distinguished career in the naval service of a neighbouring power. But then, he said stiffly, how do you put it in English? Then I copied my blotting book. I, of course, do not desire to go into details. At any rate, I thought to myself, even if I shall not be actually at sea, at any rate, at least I shall be able to put my finishing touches on the revision of my monograph on the deep-sea fishes. But the High Command was even more loath with me than I had thought. How did they punish me? Did I deserve such punishments? So here I am, naval attaché in Bella, a river port, capital of a nation exceedingly honourable, to be sure. He bobbed a hasty bow to Eszterhazy, who languidly returned it. But one who has no deep-sea coast at all, woe! For a moment he said nothing, only breathed deeply. Then, what interest could anyone possibly find in a freshwater fish, I do inquire you? He entreated. But no one had an answer. Said Milord Sir Smiht. Yes, know what it is to be an exile myself. Still, I stay strictly away from politics, you know. Not my pigeon. Whigs and Tories, nothing to me. Plague on both their houses. Sea fish, rich in phosphorus, brain food. But the commander had not made himself clear. What he would wish to propose of the Milord Sir Smiht was not political, it was scientific. Could not Sir Smiht, by means of the idyllic— what? Thousand pardons, the odyllic force, of which one had heard much, could not Sir Smiht produce an ensampling of, say, the waters of the Mindanao Trench, or of some other deep-sea area here in Bella, so that the commander might continue his studies? The milord threw up his hands. "Impossible!" he cried. "Impossible! Think of the pressures. One would need a vessel of immensely strong steel, with windows of immensely thick glass. Just to begin with, cost much, possibilities of success dubious." But the naval attaché begged that these trifles might not stand in the way. The cost was to be regarded as merely a first step, and one already taken. He hinted at private means. As for the rest, Eszterhazy stepped forward, a degree of interest showing in his large eyes. At least, as for the steel, there are the plates for the Ignatz Louis. The Ignatz Louis. With what enthusiasm the nation, particularly the patriotic press, had encouraged plans for the construction of the Triune Monarchy's very first dreadnought, a vessel which, it was implied, would strike justly deserved terror into the hearts of the enemies, actual or potential, of Scythia, Pannonia, Transbalkania. A new day, it was declared, was about to dawn for the Royal and Imperial Navy of the fourth largest empire in Europe. A navy which had until then consisted of 3 revenue cutters, 2 gunboats, 1 lighthouse tender, and the Monitor Furioso, formerly the Monadnock, purchased very cheaply from the United States after the conclusion of the American Civil War. Particular attention had been drawn to the exquisitely forged and incredibly strong steel plate made in Sweden at great expense. Alas, the day of the Triune Monarchy, as one of the naval powers of the world, had been exceedingly short-lived, and more or less terminated upon the discovery that the Ignatz Louis would draw 4 feet more than the deepest reaches of the river Ister at high water in the floods. The cheers of the patriotic press were overnight reduced to silence. Subsidies for the dreadnought vanished from the next budget. The skeleton of the vessel slowly rusted on the ways. The exquisitely forged and incredibly strong steel plating remained in the storage sheds of the contractor, and the 2 gunboats and the Monitor alone remained to strike terror into the hearts of, if not Russia and Austria-Hungary, then at any rate Graustark and Ruritania. The downcast face of the foreign naval commander slowly began to brighten. The countenance of the English wizard likewise relaxed, and as though by one common, if semi-silent, consent, they drew up to the table and began to make their plans.
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a, cette affaire d'une visite anglais aux Scythie, Pannonie, Transbalkanie?
They asked in Paris.
C'est naturellement une espèce de blague,
they answered in Paris.
Envoyez-le à Londres,
they concluded in Paris. What can the chaps mean? They asked each other in London. English visa, Milord Sir Smiht, makes no sense, you know. Well, doesn't away, you know, they said in London. Of course, that should be vizier, and Sri, of course, is an Indian religious title. Don't know what to make of Smitty, though. Hindi, Gujarati, look here. Sir Augustus is our Indian expert. Send it up to him, they said in London. Very well, then, but look here. What can this be about Czech Novotny? They simply can't spell in Paris, you know. Check up on the Novotny. What are the Novotny? Blest if I know. Some hill tribe or other. Not our pigeon. Best send it all up to Sir Augustus, they said in London. But in Prague they sat down to their files, which, commencing with Novotny, Abelard, ran for pages and pages and pages, down to Novotny, Zygmunt. They had lots and lots of time in Prague, and anyway it was soothing work, and much more to their tastes than the absolutely baffling case of a young student who thought that he had turned into a giant cockroach. They had directed the old hall porter at the Grand Dominic to inform all would-be visitors that Milord Sir Smiht was not receiving people at present. But Frau Puprikosch was not one to be deterred by hall porters. Indeed, it is doubtful if she understood what he was saying, and before he had finished saying it, she had swept on, and into the large, old-fashioned chamber where the 3 were at work. "Not now," said Smiht, scarcely looking up from his adjustments of the tubing system to the steel-plated diving bell. "I can't see you now." "But you must see me now," declared Frau Puprikosch in a rich contralto voice.
My case admits of no delays, for how can one live without love?
Frau Puprikosch was a large, black-haired woman in whom the bloom of youth had mellowed.
That was the tragedy of my life, that my marriage to Puprikosch lacked love. But what did I know then, mere child that I was?
She pressed one hand to her bosom as to push back the tremendous sigh which arose therefrom, and with the other she employed, as an aid to emphasis and gesticulation, an umbrella of more use to the ancient lace industry of the Triune Monarchy than of any possible guard against rain.
And what would Herr Puprikosch say if he knew what you were up to, eh? Much better go home, my dear lady, she was advised. He is dead. I have divorced him. The marriage was annulled. He is much better off in Argentina, she declared, looking all round with great interest. Argentina? Somewhere in Africa, she said, and with a wave of her umbrella, or perhaps it was really a parasol, disposed of such pedantries. What I wish of you, dear wizard, she said, addressing Eszterhazy, is only this, to make known to me my true love. Of course you can do it. Where shall I sit down here? I shall sit here.
He assured her that he was not the wizard, but she merely smiled an arch and anxious smile, and began to peel off her gloves. As these were very long and old-fashioned, with very many buttons, of the best quality mother-of-pearl, and probably from the establishment of Weitmondel in the court of the Golden Heart, the act took her no little time. And it was during this time that it was agreed by the men present between them, with shrugs and sighs and nods, that they had better accomplish at least the attempt to do what the lady desired, if they expected to be able to get on with their work at all that day.
"If the dear lady will be kind enough to grasp these grips," said Sir Smiht, in a resigned manner, "and concentrate upon the matter which is engaging her mind. Ah, yes, that's a very good grasp."
He began to make the necessary adjustments.
"Love, love, my true love, my true affinity, where is he?"
demanded Frau Puprikosch of the universal ether.
"Yoi!"
she exclaimed a moment later in her native Avar, her eyebrows going up until they met the fringe, so pleasantly arranged, of glossy black hair.
"Already I feel it begins. Yoi!"
"Yoicks would be more like it," Smiht muttered. He glanced at a dial to the end of the sideboard.
"Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "What an extraordinary amount of the idyllic forces that woman conjugates! Never seen anything like it." "Love!" declared Frau Puprikosch. "Love is all that matters. Money is of no matter. I have money. Position is of no matter. I expectorate upon the false sham of position. I am a woman of such a nature as to crave, demand, and require only love. And I know that somewhere in the true affinity of my soul, where are you?" she caroled, casting her large and lovely eyes all around. "Ooh!"
The hand of the dial, which had been performing truly amazing swings and movements, now leaped all the way full circle, and, with a most melodious twang, fell off the face of the dial and onto the ancient rug. At that moment sounds, much less melodious, but far more emphatic, began to emanate from the interior of the diving-bell. And before Eszterhazy, who had started to stoop toward the fallen dial hand, could reach the hatch-cover sprang open, and out flew, there is really not a better verb, out flew the figure of a man in vigorous early middle age, and without a stitch or thread to serve, as the French so delicately put it, pour cacher sa nudité, "Yoy!" shrieked Frau Puprikosch, releasing her grip upon the metal holders and covering her face with her bumbershoot. "Good heavens! A woman!" exclaimed the gentleman who had just emerged from the diving bell. "Here, dash it, Pemberton Smith, give me that!" So saying, he whipped off the cloak, which formed the habitual outer garment of the wizard Anglais, and wrapped it around himself, somewhat in the manner of a Roman senator who has just risen to denounce a conspiracy. The proprieties thus taken care of, the newcomer, in some perplexity, it would seem, next asked, "Where on earth have you gotten us to, Pemberton Smith? And why on earth are you rigged up like such a guy? Hair whitened, and I don't know what else, eh?" Pemberton Smith, somewhat annoyed, said, "I have undergone no process of rigging. It is merely the natural attrition of the passage of 30 years. And tell me, then, how did you pass your time on the sidereal level, or, if you prefer, astral plane?" "But I don't prefer," the man said briskly. "I know nothing about it. I had come up from the observatory. Damned silly notion, putting an observatory in Wales. Skies obscured 300 nights a year with soppy Celtic mists, all the pubs closed on Sundays, and happening to drop in on the Royal Society, I allowed myself to act as subject for your experiment. One moment I was there, the next moment I was there." He gestured toward the diving bell. Then something evidently struck his mind. 30 years, you say? Good heavens!" An expression of the utmost glee came across his face. "Then Flora must be dead by now, skinny old bitch. And if she isn't, so much the worse for her, for who is this lovely lady here?" The lady herself, displacing her parasol and coming toward him in full-blown majesty, said in heavily accented but still melodious English, "Is here the Madame Puprikosch, but you may be calling me Yoshinka, my affinity, my own true love, produced for me by the genius of the wizard Anglais. Yoy!" And she embraced him with both arms, a process which seemed by no means distasteful to the gentleman himself. "If you don't mind, Pigafetti Jones," the wizard said, somewhat stiffly, "I will thank you for the return of my cloak. We will next discuss the utmost inconveniency which your disappearance from the chambers of the Royal Society has caused me throughout 3 decades. All in good time, Pemberton Smith," said the former Astronomer Royal of Wales, running his hands up and down the ample back of Frau Puprikosch, or, as she preferred to be called by him, Yoshinka. "All in good time. I say, Yoshinka, don't you find that corset most restrictive? I should. In fact, I do. Do let us go somewhere where we can take it off, and afterwards I shall explain to you the supernal glories of the evening skies, beginning, of course, with Venus." To which the lady, as they made their way toward the door together, replied merely but expressively, "Yoy!" Standing in the doorway was a very tall, very thin, very, very dignified elderly gentleman in cutaway striped trousers, silk hat. A silk hat which he raised, although somewhat stiffly, as the semi-former Frau Puprikosch went past him. He then turned, and regarding the wizard Anglais with a marked measure of reproof, said, "Well, George? Good heavens! Augustus! Is it really you?" "It is really me, George." "Well, George, I suppose that you have received my letter?" "I have received no letter." "I sent it you, care of Cook's, Poona. You haven't been in Poona for years, good gad. That must be why my damned remittances kept arriving so late. I must have forgotten to give them a change of address." Sir Augustus Smith frowned slightly, and regarded his brother with some perplexity. "You haven't been in Poona for years?
Then what was all this nonsense of your calling yourself Vizier Sir Smiht, and trying to rouse the hill tribes with the rallying cry of No Votany? Votanies were abolished, along with the tax on grout, the year after the mutiny. Surely you must know that. I haven't been in India for 11 years, I tell you, not since the presidency cut up so sticky that time over the affair of the rope trick, all done by the Odilic forces, I tell you. As for all the rest of it, haven't the faintest idea. Call myself Vizier Sir Smiht, indeed. What do you take me for?
Sir Augustus bowed his head and gently bit his lips. Then he looked up. "Well, well," he said at last. "This is probably another hugger-mugger on the part of the junior clerks. Not the first time, you know. Won't be the last," he sighed. "I tell you what it is, you know, George. They let anyone into Eton these days. Good heavens! Fact. Well, He looked around the room with an abstracted air. "Ah, here it is, you see, now that I have seen with my own eyes that Pigafetti Jones is alive and playing all sorts of fun and games, as I dare say he has been doing all these years. See no reason why you shouldn't come home, you know, if you like." "Augustus, do you mean it?"
"Certainly."
The younger Smith reached into the clothes-press and removed therefrom a tightly packed travelling bag of ancient vintage.
"I'm quite ready then, Augustus," he said.
There was a clatter of feet on the stairs in the corridors beyond, the feeble voice of the hall porter raised in vain, and into the room there burst Cummelman Svartbloy, who proceeded first to fall at the younger Smith's feet, and next to kiss them.
"My wife!" he cried. "My wife has just had twin boys! Bella is guaranteed another generation of brothers Svartbloy snuff tobacco. Thank you, thank you, thank you!"
And he turned and galloped away, murmuring that he would have stayed longer, but that it was essential for him to be at the mill in a quarter of an hour in order to grind the rappee. "Do twins come up often in the chap's family?" asked Sir Augustus.
"I'm afraid that nothing much comes up often in his family at all any more. I merely advised him to change his butcher, and I may have happened to suggest the well-known firm of Schlock-Hocker in the Ox Market. Old Schlock-Hocker has 6 sons, all twins, of whom the youngest, Pishtu and Nishtu, act as delivery boys on alternate days. Wonderful thing, change of diet, that, and, of course, the Odilic forces."
Sir Augustus paused in the act of raising his hat to his head. "I should hope, George," he said, "that you have not been the means of introducing any spurious offspring into this other tradesman's family." His brother said that you didn't know about that. Fellow and his wife were first cousins, after all. Sir Augustus nodded again, lifted his hat, and this time gestured to the multitudinous items upon the heavy old sideboard. "Do you not desire to remove your philosophical equipment?" he asked. Smith the younger considered. He looked at his own hat, the velvet cap of curious cut with the curious silver medallion on it. He took it in both hands and approached Dr. Eszterhazy. Dr. Eszterhazy bowed. George William Marmaduke Pemberton Smith placed the cap upon the head of Engelbert Eszterhazy, Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Jurisprudence, Doctor of Science, Doctor of Literature, etc., etc. "You are now, and henceforth," the Englishman said, "the wizard of the triune monarchy, and may regard yourself as seized of the entire equipage of the Odilic force, or rather forces. Sorry I can't stay, but there you are."
The brothers left the room arm in arm, Sir Augustus inquiring, "Who was that odd-looking chap, George?" and his junior replying, "A phrenologist fellow, can't recollect his name. Does one still get good mutton at Simpson's? One gets very good mutton still at Simpson's. Haven't had good mutton since—" Voices and footsteps alike died away. Dr. Eszterhazy looked at the equipage of the idyllic forces, and he slowly rubbed his hands together and smiled.
What'd you think?
I think it's wonderful. It's and if you're going to adapt the Eszterhazy ones, it's one of the ones that is easier to adapt
Yeah.
because there's part of the problem with Eszterhazy is that in lots of things he is simply an observer of what's happening and thinking things, and that's not particularly good in visual terms. But this one does actually have, a plot you can see on the screen and can understand.
Yep.
Good. But yeah, it's a great story.
Anything, I'm sure I've missed things because that's typically what I do in Avram stories. But one of the things in the world of Dr. Eszterhazy that I found fascinating is magic versus science versus the time and place where we are. Is Sir Smiht a fraud? Is he like? What were your thoughts on that? I'm just curious if you had any
I
thoughts
know,
there.
knowing a bit about the period, there wasn't the boundary between magic and science at the time. And I particularly know a lot about Paris in that sort of period. And there were loads of alchemists, of people who things like rituals and horoscopes and all sorts of things were just part of the landscape at that time. And the difference between magic and science was very thin. Alchemy was regarded as a fairly legitimate part of science at that period. So, in a sense, I don't think things are as clear cut as we would have them now. Certainly not at that period. And there's lots of things which are open to question. Well, I think deliberately from Avram as to whether things that there are clearly some charlatans in the stories, but there are also clearly some people who do have powers which aren't immediately amenable to being analyzed by science.
I mean, there were some fantastical things that happened, right? The table moving during the calling of the dead, talking to the Brazilian wizard, uh, finding someone and sending them through time and space. So all those struck me as great, but with very little explanation, of course.
Yeah,
And when you started with a little thing, that's kind of interesting. I didn't think about this. When you start with a little thing like the moving of the table, you think, oh, he's a total fraud. And then you keep progressing and he's doing more and more interesting things. Anyways, any other thoughts on that?
no, it's the Arthur C. Clarke quote, isn't it? That any um, significantly advanced science is always going to appear to people as magic. I mean, we don't question how the transporter works on Star Trek. Um, so there are things which are table moving, and there will be loads of mediums who'll be doing table moving and who are well believed by people who you'd have thought were as skeptical as Arthur Conan Doyle, who thought there were some fake mediums, but there were lots of real ones as well. Most of whom was then exposed as being fake as well, but that's a separate issue.
All right, going back to an adaptation. how if someone threw $500 million to you to build an Eszterhazy world, how, or this story in particular, would it be a series? Would it be a series of movies? How would you adapt it, and who would play Dr. Eszterhazy in your vision?
I think it would be a series. I mean, the challenge, as I said before, is that a lot of the stuff happens inside his head in terms of his observations of things without us understanding all of the references, which you would never get simply by watching him standing watching people. So you'd probably have to build in a sort of Watson figure, the person to whom things are explained or with whom they're discussed, so that you get some of that sense about things, and you then can then understand a bit more what's happening and understand when the later plot points reveal things. And in terms of who would play him, I thought David Hyde Pierce would be a good Eszterhazy. Obviously, everybody knows him from Frasier, but he was played a wonderful part in the Julia Child biopic series, which was on fairly recently. And he's an enormously versatile actor. And as we know from at least one episode of Frasier, can actually sword fight. So that would be quite useful.
Well, before we sign off, anything else about the story in particular, and anything else you would just want to add about the world of Eszterhazy?
I did try and date the story because
Okay.
um, there aren't any dates which are explicitly mentioned in any of the stories, and it must be after 1889 because the Brazilian wizard mentions the Emperor of Brazil being deposed, which was 1889. But there's also a reference to a student in Prague thinking he's turned into a giant beetle, which of course is a Kafka reference. But as Kafka would only be 6 in 1899, that may just be a joke.
Yep.
Because in Avram stuff, somebody once said about Bob Dylan that some stuff has deep significance in his lyrics. Some stuff is just there because he needs a rhyme. And other stuff is there just for a joke. And I think Avram's the same. A lot of the stuff has got deep significance, but a few things are thrown in there just because he thought it was funny.
Yeah.
And indeed it is.
What else? Anything else that struck you particular about the story?
I mean, again, it is typical of the time. That was the joy of, even though the location may be imaginary, the things like remittance men, which is the sons who they can't get into the military or the church, being sent off, particularly if they're a bit dissolute, normally to the far-flung regions of the British Empire where they hope they can't do any damage. But that sort of person who's living on an allowance and moving around is typical of the period. And it's again the 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 perfect plotting in it of the different elements all coming together, even if it's in a fantastic way, it is still all planted early on and then comes to fruition by the end.
Well, as always, this has been amazing. I love what you uh, bring to the episode, what you're able to draw out of the stories. It's way more than I can. So again, I'm just so appreciative of you taking the time.
That's my pleasure. Google, that's the answer. That's my best friend. You Google things and follow the breadcrumbs down a rabbit hole.
That and AI now can help you track things down.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Tim. We'll definitely have to do it again.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And keep bringing out the Davidson unearthed treasures.
I'm going to keep at it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I suppose God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.